There is a small vineyard in Paris, not in the suburbs, not in some distant park, an actual working vineyard with rows of grapevines climbing up a steep hillside, ripening in the autumn sun, just a few hundred meters from one of the most photographed cathedrals in Europe. It is hidden behind a stone wall on a quiet back street. Most days you cannot get inside it. The tourists who pass within a block of it on their way up to the Sacré-Coeur almost never notice it is there. It is the last vineyard in Paris. It was planted on a slope where, 2 centuries ago, gypsum quarries collapsed beneath the neighborhood and left half the hillside hollow. Today, it produces a few hundred bottles of wine a year. Wine that, by general agreement, is not very good. Someone once called it the most expensive bad wine in Paris. Once a year, in October, the whole neighborhood holds a festival to celebrate the harvest, with parades and music and speeches and bottles of the questionable vintage sell for absurd prices to support local charities. This is the kind of thing Paris does. It keeps a vineyard alive on the side of a hill in the middle of one of the densest cities in Europe, just because somebody a long time ago decided that the hill should still be a hill, that the village on top of it should still be a village, that the past should not be entirely paved over. Welcome back to Paris. This is part 2 of our journey through the hidden city. In the first episode, we walked through the heart of old Paris, the island in the river, the Latin Quarter, the secret chapels and gardens of the medieval town. Tonight, we are going to climb up into the hills that used to be outside the city walls, into the neighborhoods where the artists came to be poor, through the bohemian quarters of Montmartre and Montparnasse, where almost every famous painting of the early 20th century was made in a room with no heat. And then, as the night gets later, we are going to walk through the neighborhoods of Paris that no one talks about. The eastern villages, the wild park in the north, and the lost river that still runs underneath the streets. It is going to take a while. Get comfortable. Let's begin where the artists began. For most of its history, Montmartre was not part of Paris. It was a village on a hill. The hill is called La Butte, the mound, and it rises out of the northern flatlands of the city, like a small upturned bowl, capped at the top by the white domes of the Basilica of Sacré-Coeur. The view from up there is one of the most famous views in the world. You will have seen it in 100 films, on 1,000 postcards, in 1,000,000 photographs taken from the steps below the church. But the postcard view is not the Montmartre I want to take you to. Until 1860, Montmartre was a separate town. It had its own mayor, its own farms, its own windmills grinding grain on the breezy summit. It had vineyards, it had goats. The slopes of the hill were riddled with old quarries. The Romans had dug into the hillside for gypsum, what the rest of the world calls plaster of Paris. And centuries of digging had left the southern face of the butte unstable and treacherous, full of hidden tunnels and collapses. The neighborhoods at the foot of the hill were rough. Brothels, taverns, dance halls. The wealthy Parisians came up at night to slum it. In 1860, all of that changed. Baron Haussmann, the same man we met in part 1, the man who tore out medieval Paris and replaced it with the grand boulevards, annexed Montmartre into the city. He took down the customs wall that had separated it from Paris and brought it inside. The little village on the hill was now part of the metropolis. But because the hill was so steep, and because the ground was so unstable from all the old quarries, Haussmann's wide boulevards and uniform stone facades could not really get up here. The bulldozers stopped at the bottom. The narrow lanes survived. The windmills survived, some of them. The vineyard survived, and, above all, the cheap rents survived. Which meant that, by the end of the 19th century, when a generation of starving artists came to Paris looking for somewhere to live, this was where they came. A young Spaniard named Pablo Picasso arrived in 1900. He was 19 years old. He could not speak French. He had nowhere to live and almost no money. He moved into a strange wooden building on a back street of Montmartre, a building that the local poets had nicknamed the Bateau-Lavoir, the laundry boat, because it looked, from a certain angle, like one of the floating laundries that women used along the Seine. The building was condemned. The roof leaked. There was one tap of cold water for the entire block of studios, and a single foul-smelling toilet shared between 30 people. In winter, the artists slept fully dressed, sometimes with the canvas of their most recent painting laid over them as an extra blanket. It was here, in a small studio at the Bateau-Lavoir, that Pablo Picasso painted Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. If you do not know that painting, look it up. 5 women, their faces broken into angles, 2 of them wearing what appear to be African masks. It is, by general agreement, the painting that broke open the 20th century, the painting that made Cubism possible, that opened the door to modern art, that ended one tradition and began another. He finished it in 1907. He was 25 years old. He had been living on bread and tinned sardines. The original Bateau-Lavoir burned down in 1970. A replica was built on the same spot. There is a plaque on the wall, but most people walk past it without realizing what they are walking past. The cafes where Picasso drank are still here. The cabaret where he paid his bar tab in paintings, the Lapin Agile, and a small pink cottage on a corner of the Butte, with a sign painted by the artist André Gille of a rabbit jumping out of a saucepan with a bottle of wine, is still in business. It still hosts musicians. It still has the original sign, more or less, swinging from a metal bracket above the door. On the night I am imagining, it is dark inside, with low lamps and old wooden tables, and someone is playing piano in the corner. The same piano, more or less, that Eric Satie once played and that Claude Debussy occasionally came up the hill to hear. Picasso bought a painting from a friend that night, perhaps, or paid for his drinks with a sketch, or sat in a corner with the rusty old revolver he carried in his pocket, a revolver that had once belonged to the playwright Alfred Jarry, the author of the absurdist play Ubu Roy. A man so eccentric that his friends had passed the gun on to Picasso when Jarry was dying. Picasso liked to fire it off occasionally when someone in the bar started talking too pretentiously about art. There are stories of him shooting at the ceiling during arguments about Cézanne. This was the Montmartre that vanished, the one before the tour buses. You can still find pieces of it. Most of the people who come to Montmartre come up the front. They take the funicular or they climb the long staircase and they emerge directly in front of the Basilica of Sacré-Coeur. Then they crowd into the Place du Tertre, the square at the top, where dozens of artists set up their easels and offer to draw your portrait in 15 minutes. The Place du Tertre is one of the most touristed corners in Paris. It is, if I am honest, not the part of Montmartre I would point a friend toward. Walk away from it, down the cobbled streets to the north of the Basilica. Almost immediately the crowd thins. The shops change. Within 2 minutes, you are in a quiet residential neighborhood that looks more like a small French town than a part of the capital. Old apartment buildings with shuttered windows, cats sleeping on doorsteps, a baker, a man pruning a rosebush in a tiny front garden. Find your way to the Rue Courtauld. Number 12. There is a small museum here, the Musée de Montmartre. From the outside, it looks like nothing. A high, pale yellow wall, a modest gate. You step through it, and you are inside one of the loveliest hidden gardens in the city. There are, in fact, 3 connected gardens here. One of them is dedicated to Pierre-Auguste Renoir, who lived in this building in the 1870s when he was poor and unknown, and painted his masterpiece Bal du Moulin de la Galette, a swirling outdoor scene of dancers under the trees of the Montmartre dance hall, with models recruited from his neighbours. The garden has been replanted to resemble the kind of riotous, semi-wild flower garden that Renoir loved. There is a swing in it, a replica of the one he painted in La Balançoire. Children come and ride it. The second garden is laid out in vegetable beds and fruit trees, evoking the small plots that Montmartre's working-class residents kept here when this was farmland. The third is the Garden of Dance, looking out over the city. In the building itself, a long, low manor house, the oldest building on the Butte, Renoir kept a studio. Not just Renoir. The painter Suzanne Valadon, a former circus acrobat who fell from a trapeze, moved here later. She painted in the rooms upstairs. Her son, Maurice Utrillo, who painted Montmartre over and over in soft white and grey street scenes that became enormously popular, lived here too. So did Raoul Dufy. The walls of the building have been left in the slightly battered, lived-in state they were in when the artists worked here. Valadon's studio is still set up. Easel, palette, half-finished canvases. You can look down from the windows at the back of the building and see, sloping away below you, the famous Vineyard. It is small, smaller than you would expect. You can pick out the rows. From mid-September, the grapes are dark and ready. The Harvest Festival is in mid-October, and the vineyard opens to the public for that one weekend every year. If you cannot get in for the festival, do not despair. Just past the museum, on the next street, there is another garden you should know about. It is called the Jardin Sauvage Saint-Vincent, the Wild Garden of Saint-Vincent. It is a pocket of preserved wilderness, kept as wild and uncultivated as the city can manage, full of native plants and birds and butterflies. It is open to the public on, traditionally, the first Sunday morning of each month. 40 minutes, that is all. You walk in, you walk through, you walk out, and you do not come back for another month. This is how Paris hides things. Behind a small gate, on a back street, with opening hours that almost no one knows. Before we leave the Butte, I want to tell you a story. It is the autumn of 1870. Paris is at war with Prussia. The Prussian army, under Bismarck, has surrounded the city. There is a complete siege. Nothing goes in. Nothing comes out. The provisional government of France has fled south to the city of Tours. Paris is cut off from the rest of the country. The newspapers are not arriving. The mail is not arriving. People do not know what is happening to their families in the south, or whether the war is being lost or won. A photographer named Félix Tournachon is living in Montmartre. He is famous in the small circles where photographers are famous. He goes by the professional name Nadar. He has photographed Victor Hugo and Sarah Bernhardt and George Sand. He has, more recently, become obsessed with hot air balloons. He has built enormous balloons capable of carrying 20 people, fitted with elegant dining cabins, in which he has flown above the rooftops of Paris and taken, for the first time in human history, aerial photographs of a city. When the Prussians close their siege around Paris, Nadar has an idea. He proposes to the desperate provisional military commanders that he take his balloons up from the high ground of Montmartre and use them, first, to spy on the Prussian positions. Then, once the encirclement is complete and the city is fully cut off, he proposes to launch the balloons unmanned or with one or two pilots and float them with sacks of mail and dispatches over the heads of the Prussian army out toward the free territory in the south. It is the world's first airmail. He gets permission. He sets up his base on the heights of the Butte. On the 23rd of September 1870, Nadar's balloon Le Neptune lifts off from Montmartre, carrying more than 250 pounds of mail, drifting east on the wind, over the Prussian lines, over the German artillery positions. The balloon eventually comes down in the countryside. The mail is delivered. Over the next 4 months, 66 balloons leave Paris. The Prussians shoot at them with rifles and even with experimental anti-aircraft guns, but most of them get through. The balloons carry mail, dispatches, government officials, even pigeons. The pigeons are for the return trip, because the problem with balloons is that you cannot steer them. You can fly them out, but you cannot fly them back. So an engineer in Tours, working with a man who had recently invented a process for shrinking documents onto thin films of microphotography, comes up with a solution. The dispatches and personal letters from the rest of France are photographed onto tiny strips of microfilm. The microfilm is rolled up and put into hollow goose quills. The goose quills are tied with silk thread to the legs of homing pigeons. The pigeons are then flown back to Paris in the balloons. Over the course of the siege, the pigeons carry close to 100,000 messages back into the besieged city. It is one of the strangest stories in the history of Paris. A photographer who turned his hobby into a wartime communications system. A city that, when cut off from the world, learned to fly its mail across enemy lines. The whole operation began on the hill we just walked through. There is a small park on the Butte called the Square Nadar that is named after him, with benches looking out over the city. And most people who sit there never know what happened above their heads in the autumn of 1870. Now picture the woman who became, perhaps, the most legendary figure of Montmartre. Her name was Louise Michel. She was a school teacher. She came to Paris in the 1850s to teach reading to the poor children of Montmartre. She was a passionate believer in education for the working class, in equal rights for women, in the dignity of the very poor. When the city of Paris rose up against the national government in 1871 in the violent uprising known as the Commune, a brief, bloody, doomed working-class revolution that controlled Paris for 2 months before it was crushed, Louise Michel was one of its leaders. She fought on the barricades. She organized first aid. She set up daycare for the children of the fighters. When the Commune fell and the army took the city back street by street, killing thousands, she was arrested. At her trial, she dared the court to execute her. They refused. They sent her instead to a prison colony in the South Pacific. She survived. She came back. She lived another 25 years, organizing, teaching, agitating. When she died in 1905, the funeral procession through the working-class districts of Paris was one of the largest the city had seen in 20 years. There is now a small terraced park on the slope of the butte, just below the basilica, called the Square Louise Michel. It used to have a more bureaucratic name. The neighbors lobbied the city to rename it. It is now the park that everybody walks through to climb up to Sacré-Coeur, and almost nobody who walks through it knows whose name is on the sign at the entrance. The hill is full of these layers: quarries below, balloons above, vineyards in between, history sleeping in the cobblestones. Across the city, on the southern edge of Paris, there is another building like the Bateau-Lavoir. It is called La Ruche, the beehive, and it is more or less round. In the late 19th century, a wealthy society sculptor named Alfred Boucher had an idea. He wanted to create cheap studio space for poor artists. He bought a piece of leftover land in the south of Paris, in a working-class neighborhood near the slaughterhouses, and he acquired, at scrap prices, a strange round metal pavilion that had been built for the 1900 World's Fair. The pavilion was an octagonal iron and glass structure that had served as the wine pavilion at the fair. When the fair ended, it would have been demolished. Boucher hauled it across Paris and reassembled it in his lot. He divided the inside of it, like a wedge of cheese, into tiny pie-shaped studios. The studios radiated out from the central staircase. Each one had a small triangular skylight in the roof. He charged almost no rent. The artists who came were, as he intended, the poorest of the poor. The beehive opened in 1902. Within a few years, it housed, among many others, Marc Chagall, Chaim Soutine, Amedeo Modigliani, Diego Rivera, Fernand Léger, and the Romanian-born sculptor Constantin Brancusi. Some of these names are now world famous. At the time, they were starving. The conditions were brutal. Chagall later wrote about how, in winter, he would paint while wearing every piece of clothing he owned. The smell from the slaughterhouses up the street drifted in through the cracks in the walls. There were rats. The toilets were communal and frequently broken. Soutine, the Lithuanian-born painter who would later become famous for his violent, almost unbearable canvases of slaughtered animals and disturbed faces, was so poor he sometimes did not eat for days. Modigliani lived nearby in a separate cluster of shacks called the Cité Falguière, a similar arrangement, slightly less round, slightly more tubercular. He was already coughing blood. He drank too much. He sketched constantly on whatever scraps of paper he could find. There is a story about Soutine, told by one of his neighbors. One bitterly cold winter night, and the neighbor came home to find Soutine's studio glowing with light and warmth. Curious, he opened the door. Inside, Soutine had built a fire in his stove. He was burning everything in the room: his furniture, his books, his bedclothes, eventually his paintings, anything that would burn. He was burning his own work because he was cold. This is the price the great art of the early 20th century was paid for. The Bateau-Lavoir on top of the hill in the north, the beehive in the slums of the south, and 100 smaller places in between. These were the rooms in which most of the famous paintings now hanging in the great museums of the world were actually made. The artists were, for the most part, miserable. They were hungry. They were sick. Many of them died young. Modigliani would die of tubercular meningitis in 1920, at the age of 35. His fiancée, 8 months pregnant, would throw herself out of a fifth-floor window the next day. Soutine would die during the German occupation on the run from the Gestapo of a perforated ulcer. Picasso, in contrast, would live to be 91 and become one of the wealthiest artists in history. But that is part of the story too. The bohemian Paris of the early 20th century was not romantic. It was very, very hard. The beehive is still there. It is still a working artists' colony. The roof has been repaired. The walls have been patched. The artists who live in it now are still chosen for the rent, extremely low, by a board that tries to support working artists who cannot otherwise afford to live in Paris. You cannot get inside without an invitation. But you can stand at the gate or on the passage Danzig and look in through the bars at the round building in the courtyard, surrounded by sculpture and overgrown plants, and know that this is where Chagall painted his floating violinists, and where Soutine burned his paintings to keep warm, and where, somehow, the modern world made itself. Let me tell you now about the river you cannot see. You already know about the Seine. The Seine bisects Paris from east to west. It is the river of every postcard. Boats slide along it. The bridges of the city are named for kings and saints. The Seine is, of course, what makes Paris Paris. But Paris has a second river, or had one. Its name is the Bièvre. The Bièvre is small. It rises in the hills southwest of Paris, near the town of Guyancourt, runs north for about 35 kilometers, and joins the Seine on the left bank, just east of Notre Dame. For most of its history, it was a real river. It had ducks. It had beavers, which is, in fact, where it gets its name. Bièvre is an old French word for beaver. People fished in it. They washed clothes in it. They built watermills along it, grinding flour. In the warmer months, children played on its banks. In the 17th century, a man named Jean Gobelin set up a textile dyeing workshop on the banks of the Bièvre, in what is now the 13th arrondissement. The water of the Bièvre, it turned out, contained minerals that made it ideal for fixing dye into wool. He started producing tapestries. The tapestries became famous. They became the Gobelins tapestries, and the workshop he founded became the Manufacture des Gobelins, the Royal Tapestry Works, which produced some of the most magnificent decorative art of the 17th and 18th centuries. The Sun King, Louis XIV, took a personal interest in it. Tapestries from the Gobelins ended up on the walls of palaces all over Europe. But the dyes were filthy. The workshops poured chemicals and dye and animal blood into the river for hundreds of years. Other workshops followed. Tanneries, slaughterhouses, washing houses for the city's laundries. By the 18th century, the Bièvre was running dark. By the 19th century, it was running black. It stank. It carried disease. In a heavy rain, it overflowed its banks and flooded the surrounding slums with what was, by then, essentially raw industrial waste. Around the turn of the 20th century, the city of Paris made a decision. It decided to make the river disappear. Beginning in the 1880s and continuing into the early 1900s, the Bièvre was buried, not diverted, not cleaned up, buried. The city built brick and concrete tunnels along the river's course, channeled the water into them, and then paved over the top. Streets were laid where there had been water. Buildings rose. Apartment blocks went up over the buried river. Within a generation, almost no one in Paris could even tell you where the Bièvre had been. But it is still there. The water still flows. It is now part of the sewer system, but it is still there, still running through its old channel in the dark, beneath the cellars of restaurants and the basements of offices, beneath cobblestones and metro tunnels and the foundations of grandmothers' apartments. There is a map. If you look it up, you can trace the path of the buried Bièvre across the south of Paris. Once you have seen the map, you start to notice things. The way certain streets dip slightly. The way certain buildings curve around nothing on the surface. The way certain small parks have a vaguely damp feeling in the air, even on a hot day. In the 13th arrondissement, the city has done something remarkable. They have, in 2 short stretches, opened up the cover. In a small park called the Square René Le Gall, a section of the buried Bièvre has been brought back into the open. A piece of the old river runs across the surface of the park between weeping willows. Children stand on the small bridge and watch the water. Then it disappears again into a tunnel under the trees and goes back into the dark. Somewhere, the city is starting to talk about uncovering more of it. Now, the argument is environmental and aesthetic and emotional. A city should not bury its rivers. A city is a more interesting place if it admits openly what flows beneath it. Stand for a few minutes at that small bridge in the Square René Le Gall. Watch the river that almost no one visits. This is the lost river of Paris. There is one place where it briefly comes up for air. We are going to walk now to the eastern edge of the city. This is a part of Paris that almost no foreign visitor ever sees. The neighborhoods here, Charonne, Belleville, Ménilmontant, the upper edges of the 19th and 20th arrondissement, were, like Montmartre, separate villages until the 1860s. They were absorbed into Paris by Haussmann. Unlike Montmartre, they did not become famous. There is no equivalent up here of the Sacré-Coeur or the Place du Tertre, nor the postcard image. The metro lines that come out here run almost empty, sometimes in the evening. The streets are narrower. The buildings are lower. The accent is different. This is where Parisians live. There is a working-class memory here that goes very deep. This is where the Commune of 1871 fought its last stand. After the army took back the city, they pushed the last of the communards eastward into the cemetery of Père-Lachaise, and there, against a stone wall in the southeastern corner, they shot the survivors. 147 men and women. The wall is still there. It is called the Mur des Fédérés, the Wall of the Federated. There is a plaque on it. People come, even now on the anniversary of the executions, and lay flowers. Throughout the year, there are always flowers there. Père-Lachaise is the largest cemetery in Paris and one of the loveliest. It is a hill. It is full of trees. It has more than 70,000 graves. The famous ones are signposted. Oscar Wilde, with his stone tomb covered in lipstick kisses, until they put up a glass barrier to stop people from kissing it. Jim Morrison of The Doors, whose grave is the most visited in the cemetery and constantly surrounded by fans, bottles of whiskey and graffiti. Frédéric Chopin, whose grave is more dignified and frequently has fresh flowers. Edith Piaf, the great singer of working-class Paris, with simple stone and her name engraved. But the grave I want you to see is harder to find. It is the grave of Eloise and Abelard. You remember them from part 1. The 2 great medieval lovers of the Ile de la Cité, the brilliant philosopher and his equally brilliant student, who fell in love and were torn apart. They lived 850 years ago. Héloïse died in 1164 in the abbey she ran in the countryside east of Paris. She had asked, before she died, to be buried beside Abelard, who had died 22 years before her. According to the legend, and it is a legend, although a touching one, when her coffin was lowered into his crypt to lie beside him, his arms reached up out of the dust and embraced her. For 600 years, they lay together in their abbey in Champagne. During the French Revolution, the abbey was destroyed. The remains of the two lovers were transferred eventually in 1817 to Paris, to Père-Lachaise, where the city had built them a small Gothic-style canopy in stone. They lie there now, side by side under the canopy, with figures of them carved in stone above. Couples come and leave flowers. Letters are sometimes left on the grave. Letters about heartbreak, about lost love, about hope. Their grave is in the southwestern corner of the cemetery, near the avenue Casimir-Périer. It is signposted, but you have to look. Go and pay your respects. Now walk, or take a taxi, or ride the metro to the north of the city. In the 19th arrondissement, on a hill in a working-class neighborhood that almost no visitor ever sets foot in, there is a park. It is called the Parc des Buttes-Chaumont. It is one of the largest parks in Paris, and it is one of the strangest. If you do not know about it, walking into it for the first time is a small revelation. Most Parisian parks are formal, geometric paths, clipped boxwood, fountains, statuary. The Buttes-Chaumont is the opposite. It is wild, it is dramatic, it has cliffs. There is a small lake in the middle of it, and rising out of the lake is a sheer rock island with a Roman-style temple on top. To get to the temple, you cross a swaying suspension bridge, or, if you prefer, an arched stone footbridge that the Parisians call the Pont des Suicides, the suicide bridge, because of how many people have, over the years, used it for that purpose. There is, today, a high wire mesh on both sides. There is a waterfall. There is an artificial cave with stalactites carved into the ceiling. There are paths winding up the cliff. The whole thing feels, at moments, almost like a stage set for a romantic painting, and that, in fact, is more or less what it is. Until 1864, this place was a hellhole, a terrifying ravine on the edge of Paris where the city dumped its dead horses and its sewage. Earlier, it had been a place of public execution. Bodies of executed criminals were left to rot here as a warning. The smell in summer must have been unimaginable. Local people called it the Mont Chauve, the Bald Mountain. Nothing grew on it. Nobody went near it. Then Napoleon III, the same emperor whose right-hand man Haussmann was rebuilding the rest of Paris, decided that the city needed parks. Public parks. Open spaces where the working-class people of Paris could come on Sundays and breathe. He commissioned the Buttes-Chaumont. The job was given to Adolphe Alphand, a remarkable engineer-landscaper who would design most of Paris's parks during this period. Alphand looked at the rotten ravine and the stinking pit, and instead of levelling it, which is what most engineers would have done, he decided to amplify it, to turn its ugliness into drama, to use the cliffs that had once been quarry walls and the holes that had once been pits, and to remake them as wild scenery. He brought in artificial soil. He planted thousands of trees. He flooded the lowest pit and turned it into a lake. He left the central rock pillar standing in the middle of the lake and built a Roman temple on top of it. He carved paths into the cliffs. He built 2 bridges. He arranged for water to be pumped to the top of the rock and to fall, as a waterfall, into the lake below. He worked extremely fast. The whole park was finished in less than 5 years. Today, the Buttes-Chaumont is one of the favorite parks of Parisian families. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, it is full of children and dogs and picnickers and old men playing chess at the small cafe at the top. The hill in the middle of the lake, with its Roman temple, is one of the most photographed spots in northern Paris. And yet it is essentially unknown to foreign visitors, because it is in a part of the city the tour buses do not bring people to. Go up to the temple, climb the steps, lean on the railing, look out over the rooftops of northern Paris. The Basilica of Sacré-Coeur is visible in the distance, white against the sky. The roofs go on and on. This is one of the secret pleasures of Paris. The city is full of these moments. You walk into what looks like a normal local park. And you find a Roman temple on a cliff above a lake, and you realize you have somehow stepped out of the city you thought you knew. There is one more place I want to take you tonight before we end. It is in the village of Charonne, in the 20th arrondissement, just below Père-Lachaise. The streets here are still cobbled in places. The houses are old, low, with shutters and window boxes. There is a tiny medieval church on a small hill with a graveyard around it, which is unusual because almost all of the graveyards in Paris were emptied long ago. But this one survived because it was outside the city when the others were dug up. Walk up the hill, past the church. The streets behind it have a quality of stillness that you do not find in many places in Paris. There are walled gardens behind the houses. There are courtyards. The traffic of the boulevard fades. In the middle of this neighborhood is a small park. Inside the park is a small pavilion. It is one of the most enchanting hidden places in the city. The pavilion is called the Pavillon de l'Ermitage, the Hermit's Pavilion. It was built between 1723 and 1727. It belonged originally to a duchess, the Duchess of Orléans, who was the legitimized daughter of Louis XIV. The Sun King had, as is well known, many illegitimate children. She built a vast country estate out here in what was then countryside east of Paris. The pavilion was one of her follies, a small ornamental building used for parties and summer afternoons and not equipped with heat. The walls inside were painted in soft grey-on-grey murals with portraits of hermit saints. Grisaille, the technique is called, grey paintings. They were the height of fashion in the 18th century. Most of the Duchess's estate is gone, demolished, built over, forgotten. But the pavilion survived. It survived through extraordinary luck and through the quiet care of a few residents over the centuries. It was bought, lost, sold, abandoned, almost demolished, and eventually classified as a historic monument. By the 1990s, it was a wreck. The roof was leaking, the murals were peeling, the garden was overgrown. A man named Rémi Rivière, a passionate Parisian preservationist, took it on. He raised money, he organized volunteers, he restored the pavilion, room by room, mural by mural. The hermit saints, faded and weather-worn, were brought back to life. The Trompe-l'œil garden in the northern salon, a painted garden of Roman columns and false marble and small cupids, was recovered. The roof was repaired, the garden replanted. The pavilion is now open to the public. Sometimes the hours are limited. You can check online, walk in past the gate, Walk through the small garden, open the door of the little 18th century pavilion, and you are, suddenly, in a very small, very perfect French summer house from 300 years ago. The murals on the walls, the painted hermits, the cool floor, the light coming in through the high windows. It is one of the most precise time machines in Paris. You will probably be the only person in the room.